Interrogation specialist Vrethsorn had a professional philosophy. He had developed it over 23 years of practice, refined it through 417 documented sessions, and summarized it in a single sentence that he occasionally shared with junior specialists who were still learning the craft. "Every mind has a door," he said. "The door is different for every species. My job is to find the door." This was not, despite how it sounded, an optimistic philosophy. It was a technical one. Vrethsorn was not the kind of specialist who found meaning in his work beyond the work itself. He was the kind who found meaning in competence, in the precise application of knowledge to produce predictable results. He was good at his job in the way that a surgeon is good at surgery, through accumulated expertise, careful methodology, and the specific satisfaction of seeing a complex system respond as predicted. He had worked with subjects of 11 different species. He knew their neurological architectures, their psychological stress patterns, their species-specific vulnerabilities to physical and psychological pressure. He had extensive documentation on each, built from practical experience and from the Veth Dominion Intelligence Division's biological research files, which were thorough in the way that research produced by an institution with no ethical constraints tends to be thorough. He knew, for instance, that Horian subjects responded poorly to isolation but had extremely high physical pain tolerances, and that the most efficient approach combined extended social deprivation with mild but persistent physical discomfort, rather than acute pain, which they were neurologically built to manage. He knew that pill subjects had compound sensory systems that made certain frequencies of light and sound disproportionately distressing. He knew that plenary subjects had a physiological stress response that compounded rapidly under time pressure, which made artificial urgency a highly effective tool. He had, over 23 years, opened a great many doors. He had never failed to open one. This was not boasting. It was the factual record that the Intelligence Division maintained, which was 417 sessions and 417 successful extractions of operationally useful information. It was a record he intended to maintain. The subject assigned to him on the morning of session 418 was a human. Vrethsorn had reviewed the available research on humans before the session. The Intelligence Division's files on the species were thinner than he would have preferred, given that humans were recent additions to the Concordance and had not previously been subjects of Dominion intelligence operations. But the biological basics were present, and they painted a picture that was, if anything, encouraging. Humans were a species of limited physical resilience relative to most concordant species. Their pain tolerance was rated at standard galactic average, which was the polite way of saying it was not exceptional. Their psychological stress responses were complex, but not unusual in their fundamental architecture. Their social dependency was high, which was typically exploitable. Their neurological responses to specific stimuli followed predictable patterns. The preliminary assessment from the capture team described the subject. One Sergeant Marcus Webb, as moderately trained in resistance protocols, but not specifically hardened for extended interrogation. Vrethsorn read this and felt the professional satisfaction of a craftsman given straightforward work. He had opened harder doors than this. He prepared for a routine session. He would later, in the retirement filing he submitted 11 days after the session, use the word routine to describe his expectations. He would notch in the same document that this was the last time in his career he used the word routine in relation to human subjects, because the word routine, as it turned out, did not apply. The session began at 0900. Vrethsorn entered the room with the practiced ease of 2 decades. He assessed the subject with the automatic professional inventory he ran at the start of every session. Physical condition, psychological state, body language indicators, preliminary signs of stress response. Webb sat in the restraint chair with his wrists bound and looked at Vrethzorn with an expression that took Vrethzorn a moment to categorize. He had seen every version of the look that subjects gave him when he entered. Fear, which was common and useful. Defiance, which was also common and slightly less useful but workable. Resignation, which indicated prior experience and could be moved to cooperation more quickly. Blankness, which was usually a trained response. Webb's expression was none of these. It was something that Vrethzorn's 23 years of pattern recognition did not have a clean category for. It was attentive, focused, slightly evaluative. It was the expression of someone conducting their own assessment. Vrethzorn noted this and proceeded with the standard opening methodology, which was a period of deliberate environmental control, the room temperature, the lighting, the ambient sound, adjusted to produce low-level physiological stress without triggering an acute response. The goal was to establish baseline discomfort before beginning active engagement. Webb looked around the room during this period with the unhurried attentiveness of someone cataloging a new environment for future reference. His breathing was steady. His heart rate, monitored through sensors in the restraint chair, was elevated from baseline but not significantly. After 7 minutes, Vrethzorn spoke. He used the standard opening, the subject's name, a statement of the situation, an explanation of the session's general parameters, and an initial request for information. Webb listened to this with the same attentive focus he had been maintaining. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" Vrethzorn had heard this before. It was sometimes genuine curiosity, sometimes a stalling tactic, sometimes a probe for information about the interrogator. He answered as he typically answered. "What would you like to know? What's your success rate?" Webb said. Vrethzorn looked at him. Webb's expression was genuinely curious. 417 out of 417, he said. "I saw it in the briefing files they let me read before they brought me here." He paused. "They let you read those?" "Standard procedure with resistant subjects," Vrethzorn said, before he had fully decided to answer. "Knowing the interrogator's record can accelerate the acceptance phase." Webb nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "That's interesting," he said. "It didn't accelerate anything for me, but I can see why it might work on some people." Vrethzorn looked at him. He had not expected this response to the gambit, which typically produced either silence or an attempt to project confidence. A calm, intellectual engagement with the methodology was unusual. He proceeded with Phase 2. Phase 2 involved direct questioning combined with physical discomfort applied at carefully calibrated levels. Not severe pain. Vrethzorn's methodology was not built on severe pain, which he found inefficient because it triggered physiological responses that degraded information quality. He used sustained mild discomfort, the kind that wore out attention and concentration without producing the numbing effect of intense pain. Webb responded to Phase 2 with continued attentiveness and a running commentary that Vrethzorn found increasingly difficult to categorize. He did not give information. This was expected. He did not scream, beg, or plead. This was not surprising in a trained subject. What was surprising was that he talked, quite freely, about everything except the information Vrethzorn was requesting. He talked about the physiology of the pain response. He explained, with the accuracy of someone who had studied it, the neurological mechanism by which his body was processing the discomfort. He noted, without apparent distress, that the particular application Vrethzorn was using was calibrated to target the peripheral nervous system's sustained response rather than the acute response, which was an efficient choice. He mentioned that he had read about this methodology in a Concordance Intelligence training document and had thought, reading it, that it was well designed. Vrethzorn stopped. He looked at the subject. Webb looked back with the same attentive expression he had been maintaining since the session began. "You have read Concordance intelligence training documents," Vrethzorn said. "Some of them, Webb confirmed. The ones that deal with resistance training, they're quite good." He paused. "Yours are better in some areas. The psychological pressure sequencing is more sophisticated. But the Concordance materials have a better section on the long-game approach, the multi-day progression." He tilted his head slightly. "You're using a compressed timeline, which suggests you're under time pressure. That's useful to know." Vrethzorn was quiet for a moment. He was experiencing something that 23 years of practice had not produced before in a session. He was not sure what to call it. It was not uncertainty about the methodology, which was correct. It was more like the sensation of reading a map and finding that the territory was different from what the map described. He applied Phase 3. Phase 3 was psychological. Sleep deprivation combined with deliberate disorientation, sensory manipulation, time pressure simulation. It was his most complex phase, and the one that required the most careful calibration, because it walked the line between productive stress and counterproductive acute response. It worked by creating a cognitive environment in which the subject's ability to maintain structured resistance degraded faster than their underlying cooperation instinct, at which point cooperation typically produced the desired outcome. Webb went through 36 hours of Phase 3. Vrethzorn had records of other trained subjects for comparison. The median duration before meaningful degradation in Horian subjects, who had the best resistance records, was 22 hours. The record for any species was 29 hours, held by a Carathri Special Operations officer 12 years ago. Webb lasted 36 hours, and then, when Vrethzorn assessed his cognitive function at the end of that period, was still producing organized, coherent speech and maintaining the evaluative attentiveness he had begun with, not at full function. He was clearly tired. His responses were slower. His eyes showed the physiological markers of significant sleep deprivation. But he was not broken. He was not approaching the cooperation threshold that the methodology predicted. He was functioning at approximately 60% of baseline, which should not have been possible. Vrethzorn called a recess. He reviewed the session data in the monitoring room, running the physiological readings against his research files on human stress response architecture. Everything was within expected parameters. The physiological stress markers were present and progressing normally. The sleep deprivation indicators matched the documented human sleep deprivation curve. The cortisol readings showed the sustained stress response that Phase 3 was designed to produce. The subject was experiencing exactly the stress that the methodology predicted. He was just not responding to it the way the research predicted. Vrethzorn pulled up the Intelligence Division's human files and read them again, more carefully this time. He went to the supplementary section, which drew from human historical and cultural documentation rather than from direct biological research. He had skimmed it on first, reading because cultural context was typically secondary to biological response patterns. The supplementary section included a summary of human military training history. It noted, in a paragraph that Vrethzorn now read with full attention, that human military forces had developed systematic training for interrogation resistance, built around a specific insight into human psychological architecture. The insight was this: humans experienced pain and discomfort as inputs to the nervous system that were processed and responded to, as all species did. What made the human response distinctive was the relationship between cognitive function and stress tolerance. In most species, sufficient stress degraded cognitive function in a fairly linear way. In humans, cognitive function and stress tolerance were more separated. A human experiencing significant physical and psychological stress could still maintain organized thought in ways that other Species at equivalent stress levels could not. The file suggested this was an evolved characteristic. A species that had survived in an extremely high-stress environment had required the ability to think clearly while afraid, while in pain, while exhausted, while in genuine mortal danger. The file suggested that human resistance training exploited this characteristic. It trained humans to treat stress as information rather than as a threat to function, to metabolize discomfort as data, to maintain cognitive organization not despite what they were experiencing, but alongside it. Vrethsorn read this paragraph 3 times. Then he thought about Webb's behavior in the session, the running commentary, the analysis of the methodology, the attentive evaluation that had not stopped despite 36 hours of Phase 3. Webb had not been resisting the session in the way that Vrethsorn had been trying to overcome. He had been processing it. He had been turning every element of the methodology into information, filing it, metabolizing it, treating it as data about his situation rather than as pressure to be endured. He had not been fighting the door. He had been studying it. He returned to the session room on day 3. Webb looked, if anything, more alert than when Vrethsorn had left. The human's eyes tracked him entering with the same evaluative attention as before. The physiological monitors showed continued stress markers, but no escalation. "You slept," Vrethsorn said. It was not a question. The monitoring confirmed it. A 2-hour period during the recess, despite the environmental conditions that Phase 3 maintained. 2 hours was not enough to fully recover. It was enough to arrest the degradation. Webb nodded slightly. When I could, Vrethsorn sat down across from him. This was unusual. He typically remained standing during sessions. He sat because he had decided that the methodology he had been using was not the correct tool for this subject, and that sitting was the appropriate position for a different kind of conversation. He said, "Tell me something." Webb waited. "You have been analyzing this session since it began," Vrethsorn said, "treating everything I do as information to be processed. That is not a standard resistance methodology. That is something else." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's what we're taught." He paused. "Not all of it. The basic resistance training is standard. Hold as long as possible. Give as little as possible. Protect the most critical information longest. But the part underneath that is different. The part that makes the rest possible." "What part?" Webb considered whether to answer. Not, Vrethsorn thought, because he was deciding whether to give information, but because he was deciding how to explain something accurately. "You can only endure something for so long if you're just enduring it," he said finally. "That's a finite resource. It runs out." He paused. "But if you're doing something active with the experience, processing it, learning from it, turning it into something useful, the calculus changes." He looked at Vrethsorn steadily. "I've learned more about Dominion interrogation methodology in 3 days than I would have in 6 months of training briefings." Vrethsorn was very still. He thought about the door analogy. Every mind has a door. His job was to find the door. He had been looking for Webb's door in the usual places. The pain threshold, the psychological pressure points, the social isolation response. These were the places where doors typically were. He had not considered the possibility that the door worked differently, that instead of a threshold to push through, there was a process of active engagement that transformed the pressure into something other than pressure. That the door for this subject might open from the inside. He said, "In your training, how long are human soldiers expected to maintain resistance?" Webb looked at him. The question seemed to surprise him slightly. "Long enough," he said. "As long as the mission requires. And if the mission requires longer than the biological tolerance, you extend the biological tolerance." "How?" "The same way you extend any capacity," Webb said. "Practice. You train it. You find out where the actual limit is, as opposed to where it feels like it should be. And then you find out that the actual limit is further than it felt. He paused, and then you find out that the actual limit is further than that, too. Vrethsorn looked at him for a long time. He thought about 417 sessions. 417 doors found. He thought about what he was looking at now. He was looking at someone who had made the door itself into a training exercise. Someone who was, right now, in this room, under these conditions, on day 3 of a session that should have concluded on day 2, extending their actual limit by the act of being in the session. Someone for whom this was not something to survive. It was something to learn from. Vrethsorn had never encountered a subject who was using his methodology to improve their resistance in real time. He did not know what to do with this. The session concluded on day 4. When the Dominion received intelligence through a separate channel that rendered the information web held operationally obsolete. Vrethsorn filed his session report that evening. It was the most unusual report he had produced in 23 years. It said, in clinical language, that the session had not achieved its primary objective. It said that the subject had demonstrated resistance characteristics that did not match the available biological and psychological research on the human species. It said that the methodology employed was appropriate to the research profile, and that the research profile was incomplete in ways the session had revealed. It then contained a supplementary section that Vrethsorn did not typically write. He wrote it because accurate intelligence was more important than the appearance of success. The supplementary section said, human resistance to interrogation is not primarily a function of pain tolerance. Psychological stress resilience or social independence. These factors are present at standard levels. The distinctive factor is cognitive stress, decoupling. The ability to maintain organized cognitive function at stress levels that in other species produce cognitive degradation. This characteristic appears to be the result of both evolutionary history and deliberate training. Human interrogation resistance training does not focus primarily on endurance. It focuses on active engagement. Subjects are trained to treat the interrogation environment as a source of information rather than as pressure to be survived. This reframing transforms the subject's relationship to the experience in ways that prevent the depletion dynamic on which standard methodology relies. Standard methodology depends on the subject's resistance resources being a fixed or declining supply. For human subjects, the active engagement reframing means that the interrogation experience itself replenishes some portion of what it depletes. The subject is simultaneously under stress and processing that stress into capability. The practical implication is that extended sessions against trained human subjects may not produce the expected outcome trajectory. The standard degradation curve does not apply. Session duration recommendations, derived from experience with other species, significantly underestimate the time required. If the goal is achievable at all, he paused. Then he added, I am recommending that the Division commission comprehensive research on human interrogation resistance before any further sessions are conducted. The current research file is insufficient for accurate session planning. He also, in a separate document filed the same evening, submitted a retirement request. It said that he had served for 23 years and believed he had reached the limit of what his current expertise could accomplish. It said that the practice of his craft required accurate models of subject psychology, and that his models had proven insufficient for human subjects in a way he did not believe could be corrected through incremental adjustment. It said that he preferred to conclude his career with a record that reflected the limits of his knowledge accurately rather than extending it into territory where those limits were likely to produce systematic failure. He wrote, the kind of specialist who was either correct or honest about being incorrect. He had been incorrect in this session. He did not believe he had the foundation to be correct in future sessions against the same species. The Intelligence Division's director read the report and the retirement request on the same evening. She read the supplementary section twice. Then she authorized the retirement, approved the research commission, and sent a summary to the Dominion's Strategic Planning Office. The summary's final paragraph said, "Human soldiers should not be expected to respond to interrogation in ways consistent with current research profiles. The mechanisms of their resistance are different from those of other species in ways that current methodology does not address." She thought about how to summarize it further for the executive brief. She eventually wrote 3 sentences. "They are not harder to break than other species in the conventional sense. They are built differently in ways that make the concept of breaking less applicable. The door analogy does not work because they have made the door itself into part of their defense." Vrethsorn retired to a teaching position at the Intelligence Division's Training Academy. He revised his professional philosophy. The revision was small but significant. Original: every mind has a door. My job is to find the door. Revised: every mind has a door. My job is to find the door. But some doors open from the inside, and no amount of pressure from the outside changes that. He taught this to his students. He taught them the methodology, the species profiles, the importance of accurate research. And at the end of the unit on human subjects, he told them the following: "You will be tempted to assume that a species of standard physical tolerances and unremarkable biological metrics presents a standard challenge. This assumption is wrong." He paused. "Human resistance is not primarily biological. It is cognitive, and it is trained. They have learned, through a long history in a demanding environment, to think alongside their experience rather than being overwhelmed by it. They process what is happening to them. They learn from it. They use it." He looked at them. "This means a session against a trained human subject is not a one-directional process. You are not applying pressure to a passive subject. You are in an active cognitive exchange with someone who is using the session to extend their capacity." He paused one final time. "I filed for retirement because I realized I did not have the tools to address this. I am not recommending you follow my example. I am recommending that you build better tools." He collected his notes. "And that you read the supplementary section of the human research file before you walk into the room." He did not explain which section. The students who found it understood immediately. The students who did not find it encountered the information another way. The more expensive way. That, Vrethsorn considered, was usually how the most important lessons arrived.